Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Professor Paul Ingenbleek. Or it's in okay. How do you pronounce your last name?
Ingenbleek would be okay.
Okay, all right. So you are on this show because recently you penned a paper titled The Biogeographical Foundations of African Marketing Systems. What was your inspiration to write this paper, Paul? I have read several papers on the deep roots of development, but I've never read a paper on the biogeographical foundations of marketing. So your paper is unique in this regard. It is not only documenting the biogeographical foundation of African marketing systems, but it's unique in the sense that it is talking about the biogeographical foundation of marketing systems.
Maybe I should explain you a little bit about my job then. I'm associate professor of marketing at Wageningen University. This is a university specialized in life sciences, as they call it. So basically food, agriculture, and environment. In my job as let's say a marketing schooler, I came to this university because there was already someone working with a specific focus on what was called by then, let's say, developing countries. Now we would say emerging markets, but let's say Latin America, Asia, Africa, those parts of the world. And when I started that job was like the early 2000s. This was still quite unique. It was not so fashionable to do that then, but it combined two of my basic interests, namely, let's say, development and marketing. My predecessor in this job, he was very inspired by explaining me, let's say, the basic differences, saying, no, Paul, all these basic marketing theories that we know from the textbooks, they do not necessarily work in Africa or in Latin America or in other places of the world. And he always explained to me, let's say, how it was different. Then I was asking, like, why is it different there from here? And that was usually also the moment when it got silent. So it was a question that stuck to me basically through my career. I always wondered, like, why is it exactly different there? And ultimately, of course, you can relate things to development, saying, yes, it's less developed there, so markets look different, more basic products, etc. But to me, that was not a fully satisfactory answer in a way. And then basically a few years ago, I had the opportunity to take a bit of, you could say, a small sabbatical. I had my own little research project. I could visit another university, the Africa Studies Center there, where I had the opportunity also to talk to historians, to linguistic people, people a bit broader than, let's say, the community that I usually meet. In Wageningen, I also had met a historian that I found very inspiring, who was using a lot of Jared Diamond's work. And basically at that time, I was probably close to a burnout myself. I needed a project that would give me energy again. So this question came up and I thought, like, okay, this is a time that I really need to look for it and try to understand the answer to my question that had been stuck with me for that time.
All right. And how would you describe the biogeography of Africa?
The biogeography of Africa, basically geologists sometimes see it as a vast plateau, right? So it has relatively few mountain ranges, relatively few navigable rivers. Surprisingly, the coastline of Africa is shorter than that of Europe. You would expect, of course, Europe is much smaller, so it should have a shorter coastline, but because Europe has got so many islands and edges and bays, etc., it actually has a longer coastline. So in that sense, that's an important difference. The second difference is basically the orientation, and that is something that really goes back to Jared Diamond's work, of course, in which he explains that development would have started somewhere in what he calls Eurasia, so Europe and Asia, because that is, let's say, a vast landmass that is stretched on a normal map in a horizontal way. So it has an east-west orientation. Africa has a north-south orientation. And that is a fundamental difference, because for that reason, it covers different ecological zones. And different ecologies require different adaptation strategies of people. And then there's a third reason that I figured mattered really a lot, and that is that Africa is the cradle of humankind. Now you could wonder, like, does that matter? Because
Yes, it
if,
does.
let's say, humankind is born somewhere, it would give you a natural advantage, because development would start earlier. But for Africa, that was not the case, because not only humans developed there, but also the natural enemies, like microbes and diseases, have developed along with them. So actually, the advantage became a disadvantage. And I think
Paul,
ultimately, these three factors also underlie the marketing system in Africa.
Paul, being the cradle of civilization is a disadvantage because people are more likely to benefit from second mover advantage. If you originated a product, then the future prototypes will be better. So usually I tend to perceive Africa being the cradle of civilization at a disadvantage because groups that migrate, they would have been situated to navigate more complicated challenges.
Yeah, I think maybe by the time that they were migrating, I'm not sure if they were so much developed by then. Let's say it was by far not let's say civilization with a diversified economy and institutions, for example. So yeah, you're now using this analogy from let's say product innovation literature. I'm not sure if it really applies here. I think the underlying factor is mostly development. So if you would go back to 1500, let's say around the time that Columbus was sailing from Spain to Latin America, around that time, let's say the population density of Africa was comparable to that of Latin America, despite that the long history that humankind already had in Africa. So it's probably most important is the lower population density in Africa that sort of had an impact on the development.
Christopher Payik and Ola Olson have a paper on the long-run determinants of culture and economic growth, and they make a similar argument contending that migration away from original settlements is correlated with individualism and innovation.
That could be, I'm not sure if I know that paper, but
Yeah, it's a recent paper. So this is one of my explanations for deducing the argument in relation to Africa. I could be wrong. It's a testable hypothesis.
could you repeat it, please?
No, I said I could be wrong about
Yeah.
my
No,
hypothesis.
repeat the argument.
No, the argument that Africa is relatively behind because it is the cradle of civilization. This is my thesis.
Okay.
It could be wrong. It's testable.
How would you want to test it?
How would I want to test it? No, that's an interesting point because I was just about to ask another question, but I would testing an hypothesis. It's not hard. I think that we're in a place today where we have enough data sets on Africa and the rest of the world. So one way to test it would be to look at countries that are closest to the cradle of civilization and compare their innovation rates in other parts of the world. But then again, we would have to control for other factors because innovation is correlated with other correlates that are not necessarily related to being the cradle of civilization. But I don't think that is impossible to do.
I think for a long time, innovation was actually adaptation. So adaptation to conditions. And what I understood of the African marketing system is that innovation is actually much more a matter of exploration, because Africa is so diverse. There's all these different ecological zones, right? If you're at the Mediterranean, you go to the Sahara, then you enter the Sahel and the tropical rainforest, back to the savanna, back to the desert, and back to the Mediterranean climate at Cape Town. So that creates already a much bigger diversity in vegetation, in plant growth, and so on. In each zone in its own, let's say the diversity is smaller than it would be in Eurasia, because it's much wider. But the diversity between these different zones is actually much bigger. So what I see as innovation in Africa is also a bit looking for something different. If there are populations living at a certain place who found ways to adapt, for example, by fermenting foods, by brewing their own beers or spirits, by having specific fruits that they could use, by specific cooking recipes, specific skin products, and so on, you can simply start searching for them. So I think innovation in Africa was for a long time also simply exploration.
I
Rather than
agree. And
technological innovation.
I agree. And we're eventually going to discuss that part of the paper when we begin to talk about product differentiation and product specialization. But we're still on the biogeographical features of Africa's development. And
Correct.
on page not a problem. Africa is really fascinating. So on page 80, you comment on the disease environment in Africa. Africa has the highest disease load. And you're right. The fact that Africa was a fertile breeding place for new types of primates and later hominids and a variety of Homo sapiens is of importance because it gives rise to a significant biological factor, namely the evolution of germs that spread diseases. And you continue. 9 of the 10 most severe epidemic diseases in the old world originated from wild animals that were widespread in Africa. And you also contend that the disease environment forms part of the explanation for the differences in population growth across the continent. Frankima 2015 computed that the evolutionary growth rates up to the year 1500 were much smaller in Africa than in Eurasia.
Correct. Yes.
Yeah, so because of its disease burden in the pre-colonial era, this would have affected the growth of the labor force population and by extension productivity.
Yeah, Africa in that sense, of course, it's not only the cradle of humankind, but it actually had a very lively evolution of primates. So along with that evolution, indeed, also, let's say, the enemies were able to grow. And I think Frankema also mentioned somewhere that this is not only something that affected the local population, but also the first European and Asian settlers along the east and west coast of Africa were affected by this. So I think most of the early colonials had a very hard time living in Africa, and many of them actually died of those first settlers. So yeah, that should have had an impact on the population density. And I think that's one of the points that Frankema nicely describes in his paper in World Development, that by around 1500, let's say, the population density of Africa was still comparable to that of Latin America. And that is strange, of course, because Latin America was populated by humans so much later. It's an awful long walk, let's say, through Africa, through Asia, then stepping over to Alaska and walking all the way to Latin America. That takes so many generations. So Africa really had a head start. So the only logical explanation should be other factors for the lower population density, and then the disease environment is indeed one of them.
And the biogeography also implicated the formation of cities.
Yes, that's correct. And so does the population density, of course. If population density is small, then how do you populate a big city? That is not so easy. There were other reasons, of course. If you live in let's say in a small community, that's also a much safer strategy to live with than in a big city, especially in an environment where, let's say, transmittable diseases are so profound. So basically, over time, it's probably the small communities that could survive easier than the big communities against the diseases. So the traditional way of living in Africa is probably in the rural areas with relatively small separated groups, relatively separated from each other. So in smaller communities. This is also a relatively easy way. I mean, living in a city was also in Europe. It's often not, let's say, coming entirely out of free choice, right? As long as, let's say, by the time that people were just finding out how to conduct agriculture, for example, and how to make a living, you would not likely do that in big groups of people, but more likely in small groups of people. Then if you look in Africa, let's say also much of the environment is not so suitable as a confined space. If you look at places in Europe like Greece or Italy, I mean, this is mostly covered by mountain ranges, by seas and so on. So it's difficult for people to walk out if a ruler starts asking for their labor or ask them for taxation or for these kind of things. In Africa, it's actually much easier to walk out because there was plenty land with relatively few people and relatively few barriers, right? There's not so many mountain ranges that would actually or hinder people from moving on.
And this impinged on state capacity, as you write again. While living in a remote place may be a relatively safe strategy for keeping dangerous people at bay, it also hinders the process of state building as it is more difficult to retain people. Worldwide, most Asian states therefore emerge in places with circumscribed land. Within these natural boundaries, rulers could develop institutions to centralize power, tax farmers, and raise armies. The people who were taxed and recruited for armies were discouraged from leaving by natural barriers they had to cross. African rulers instead had to cope with people being able to leave easily, something that would not be unlikely if the leadership became extractive as the groups grew larger. The groups that developed state-like features found external sources of income to finance themselves. For example, by controlling mineral resources or trade routes. In this respect, the states functioned as businesses that generated income for their people rather than creating institutions for the people to effectively run their businesses and pay and pay part of their profits as taxes to the state.
Yes, so that's basically the part on state formation. Indeed, I also borrowed heavily from Ewout Frankema there. I think that is a crucial difference, and it's often the exceptions that make clear the rule, right? In this case, I think the most important exception was Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, there were these mountain ranges. That is a relatively heavily populated country. It still is, and it had a relatively early and also a relatively long-lasting civilization within Africa. But the general rule, I think, is let's say it's almost stereotypical, right? If you write a paper about, let's say, big history about a whole continent, we should be careful that we're not, let's say, stereotyping too much. But you could say the general picture that emerged elsewhere in Africa are these relatively small communities living relatively dispersed from each other. And I also like the arguments of Frankema of, let's say, some of the big examples that we know, right? If we think of big successful states like Timbuktu, But Timbuktu actually was a marketplace. It had very few buildings that showed any stature or centralization of power. There were no palaces, for example. So it was basically a trading place, a very central trading place where people would go to during the trading season and then leave again at the moments that they were that the trade was kind of off season. They would simply go back to their communities and live there.
Yes, in your paper, it's quite evident that pre-colonial Africa failed to develop city states with pyramids and other important features.
Yeah, the pyramids are in Africa, so that might be a better
No, city. Yeah,
example. I
you gave
take
that
that one.
example. That's
Yeah,
north. That's in North Africa. But
sure. Yeah.
it was a broad reference. That's not the norm.
No, that's true. That wasn't the norm. That wasn't the norm at all. And I think if you still look at Google, for example, at population density of Africa, you will still see it's relatively empty. There are a few, let's say, population concentrations, like in Ethiopia, like around the big lakes in East Africa, like at Niger, like in Nigeria at the delta of the Niger River. So these are some places that you could say these are the exceptions to the rule, but for the greater part, Africa was relatively underpopulated.
Yes, relative to land, that is the land labor scarcity dynamic.
Yes, and that's an important one, because if you have a lot of people and little land, what you start doing then is putting boundaries, right? You get states of, let's say, nobility saying like, hey, this is my land, and the people living there are need to work on my land, and I'm going to take taxes from them. You really, that such a thing can only emerge if there's relatively few land as compared to the amount of or to the number of people living there. In Africa, it's the other way around, right? There was a big amount of land, but relatively few people. So if you want to increase productivity, you will not, let's say, start fighting wars over land like they were doing in Europe, but you would start in wars over labor, trying to enslave people or find other ways to get control over people's labor. And I think these are the things that happened in several places in Africa at the time.
Some contemporary researchers are still exploring the relationship between land labor scarcity and slavery. I think it is an era of fruitful research. Many have argued that in Africa, forced labor was desirable because of the shortage of people. But
Yes.
there's some newer studies that are testing this idea.
Yeah, I know that there's a debate about it, but I think the explanation is still quite plausible, right? And the numbers also seem to support it. I mean, people adapt to the circumstances in which they live. So if you live in very different circumstances, of course, the development pattern takes a different direction than in Africa, where these conditions were so different from comparable where it did, for example, in Japan or in Korea or in Western Europe.
Now, Paul, shed some light on the implications of living in a dispersed community.
What the implications are for living in that community. It probably has some cultural implications. It's probably the area that you are interested in. It also has some economic or marketing implications, which is probably the area that I'm concerned with mostly. It basically means that if you're in a dispersed community, it's relatively difficult to send some of your goods out of that community and to send other goods in. So let's say the assortment from which you can choose as a consumer is relatively small. Probably you will have to grow much of the things that you eat yourself, or it depends on the cattle that you have. if it's even possible to live there, because also for cattle, the disease environment is not so favorable, right? Think of the tsetse flies that are actually quite lethal to cattle. So let's say the assortment is relatively sparse. Still, you might try to specialize a bit as a farmer. Maybe my farm has better supplies of water, or maybe my trees are catching more light, more sunlight than those of my neighbor. So my neighbor might specialize in some vegetables, while I'm specializing in fruits. And I could exchange my fruits for the vegetables that my neighbor has, for example. So there's probably some exchange going on. Maybe there's also some contact with let's say communities, surrounding communities that we can trade with. But ultimately, the products that we produce can only travel as far as their transaction costs go. Because if I need to travel to that other community, I might travel to land. Think if you live in a rainforest area, for example, even keeping a pathway open so that it will not be covered by bushes is going to be difficult. If you're living more in an area with wild animals, can also be a dangerous place, right? Let alone that these distances are huge. Finding your way is going to be difficult if there are also no rivers or other navigable ways to find. Think of the people living in the Sahara area, who basically navigated on the basis of the stars. So this all requires big efforts to and probably big sacrifices to make connections between these communities. So most of the goods would actually not travel so far. Only some very special goods would actually travel far. You can think of ivory, or maybe some special textiles, if there is a community that becomes specialized in weaving, for example. These might be goods that are considered as very valuable by other communities. And then a trading class will emerge that actually starts exchanging these things. And then nobody would like to travel all the way from South Africa to North Africa and back. So it's probably shorter distances. And then you get multiple markets where goods are exchanged and then maybe exchanged again in a more central marketplace, and from there finding their way back into the veins of this trading system. So in that way, you can see the typical African emerging or typical African marketing system emerging from the conditions in which people lived and from these small communities.
Exactly. And as you rightly explained for us, second, dispersion in distinct communities also has consequences for the structure of the marketing system. Traders learn that aggregating small production amounts of Traders learned that aggregating small production amounts of agricultural surpluses from different communities into larger quantities was a viable strategy to sell to buyers with higher levels of demand. This type of demand was found in communities where such products were not found, and later from traders connected to the European or Asian ships arriving at the coast. This, in turn, explains the typical system of markets at multiple levels, varying from small and local marketplaces where small-scale traders would meet producers from nearby communities and regional markets evolving. For example, at important road crossings to eventually large and centralized marketplaces in capitals. Paul, I read your article in its entirety, and after reading it, I concluded that there is a distinct difference between product specialization and product differentiation. In Africa, there was a selection for product differentiation. As you said earlier, it's a diverse continent, and people often want to acquire goods that they do not produce. The emphasis is on innovation, innovation meaning new. And product differentiation selects against the type of innovation which we usually talk about. In a product market, when you're specializing, an opportunity is created to create multiple derivatives, and some of these derivatives will become major innovations. But when the focus is differentiation, the scope for what we consider to be innovation is actually limited. Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree with that. I haven't thought of the terminology exactly in that way. I thought more of it that the sources of innovation can be different. Like I was explaining earlier, right? You can differentiate products. I mean, differentiation is in the eye of the beholder. It's in the perception of the customer who perceives a product as different from what he or she is used to. And that different product can have different origins. It can be technological change, so someone doing something differently in a production process or experimenting with new technologies to create something new, a smartphone for that matter. Or it can be, let's say, coming from sources that we didn't know of yet. So last time I was in Kenya, just before the Corona crisis, I was talking to someone who was explaining that, let's say, African cuisine was becoming very popular in Nairobi, and that there were restaurants from Uganda, from Ethiopia, from Nigeria, from Ghana. So basically African restaurants opening up in that city, and they were on the one hand seen as a bit exotic because they were offering foods that people didn't know, but at the same time also seen as authentically African. This has not so much to do with, let's say, product innovation, of course. It's really a traditional way of cooking that is being put in a new place. We also have it in our country where we have Asian kitchen, for example, and Italian food and French food for that matter. So this is in a way also different from what we are used to, but it's not, let's say, the product innovation by itself. And I think for a long time in the development of the African economy, it was often this way of exploring things, right? Because people had lived in small communities and had specialized in certain ways. They could offer things that they, maybe to their own surprise, were actually seen as very valuable by people from elsewhere. Think of people that were specialized in drying fishes, and these fishes were then transported to other communities where they were seen as a delicacy. Well, for these people in the original community, it was just a way of surviving, to get enough calorie intake, basically to survive. So I think the differentiation is really in the perception of the buyer.
Yeah, you know, by innovation, I'm referring to our own heuristic. So an innovation is transformative. Innovations disrupt markets and they change our outlook. If you create a new product, but it's not disruptive, it is not an innovation. But before we can innovate, we must specialize in products. So the creation of a product will lead to other innovations. So product specialization and product differentiation, completely different terms. They're not synonymous. We shouldn't confuse them. And I think that
Uh,
after reading your paper, I said, yes, this is one of the big problems. In Africa, innovation is new. It's not necessarily related to product specialization. As you said earlier, because of diversity, people always want to procure different goods and services.
I think so, but at the same time, I also think that specialization can be the source of differentiation.
Yes, it can lead to a new market.
Yes, and it still can. So it is very relevant also for people trying to start a business in Africa today. And that's why I do not fully agree with you. I think there's, if you look for differentiation, the specialization in these different communities can actually be a good source to come up with new products that you, for example, introduce in the big cities that are rapidly growing now in Africa.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Oh, disposition.
Yeah, specialization privileges what we consider to be an innovation, which is really a derivative of a specialized product or structure. But now we're going to talk about how the paucity of domesticated animals and plants hindered food production in Africa.
Okay. Yeah, this is basically the I think the key takeaway that we learned from Jared Diamond, right? Diamond was basically the one explaining us that horizontal or vertical really matters. Basically putting us to the awareness that, let's say, development of agriculture had to happen somewhere in Eurasia because it's the biggest landmass that stretches basically from east to west, and because it stretches from east to west, it in fact has a very big diversity of plants that can grow in the same ecological zone, but it can also therefore be transported from one place to another. So basically, those crops that were discovered in the Middle East that could be grown as on a farm, let's say, these would also grow in Spain, and they would also grow in China or in Japan, for that matter. So he was saying, on the one hand, these conditions were almost quite optimal for the dissemination of these discoveries. Well, if you look at Africa, which basically stretches north-south rather than east-west, the north-south dimension to disseminate, let's say, the seeds or the cultivated plants or animals, that's almost impossible, because whatever grows in the Sahel will not grow in the tropical rainforest, and vice versa. So you really need different plants, different adaptation strategies. That wouldn't work. The only condition in which you could distribute is then also from the east to the west, but even there, ecological differences were sometimes quite big and hindering, let alone that, of course, the diversity of plants is much smaller if your continent is less wide from the east to the west.
Let me point to this snippet published in your paper. Take the example of grasses. Less than 1% of the total number of grass species, 56 in total, have seeds large enough to be suitable for domestication for agricultural use. Of these 56 species, only 6 originally evolved in sub-Saharan Africa. 6 species is perhaps still a sufficient number, but the chance that any of them were discovered and successfully domesticated is much smaller when compared to the 33 that appeared in Western Eurasia, including North Africa.
Yes, correct, of course. And that doesn't mean that there were no plants that could be domesticated, because there are some, right? There's the sorghum is one of them. In Ethiopia, there was Anset, coffee, of course. Talking about dissemination, some things were coming from Africa and successfully disseminated. Surprisingly, something from banana is actually not even coming from Africa. It was coming from migrants that first settled on Madagascar, if I remember right, from Diamond's book. So yeah, these basically spread or disseminating these products is actually quite difficult. And if you manage to do some of them successfully, that could also be a basis of great wealth. I think some of the old empires in the area that is now Uganda were really based on banana trade and banana production for some time. So yeah, the exceptions confirm the rule, I would say there.
And then you also continue. None of the 14 main herbivorous domestic mammals, including the 5 most productive ones, sheep, goats, cows, cattle, pigs, and horses, were indigenous to Africa.
Yes, correct. With the big 5 in Africa, we often think of a safari holiday, looking at the lions, the elephants, the rhinos, and so on. But the big 5 domesticated animals were indeed not coming from Africa itself. They were coming from, they were brought in from outside. even indeed the goats that you will see everywhere around Africa now, and the chicken. I think there's just one real domesticated animal in Africa, which is maybe you can help me a bit. What's the name again? The guinea fowl, of course.
Yes, the guinea fowl. And I was going to hold on. There's another animal. Oh, sorry, not in relation to Africa. This is the Americas. The llama.
The llama,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's the Americas. Well, the kangaroo is in Africa, but I haven't the kangaroo in terms of economics. I'm yet to see evidence that it has much potential. Maybe it has potential, but I don't know.
The kangaroo, yeah, but you need to bring them from Australia, probably.
Yeah,
Well, they're
yeah,
not indigenous.
yeah. They're not native to Africa,
Yeah.
but they're in
Yeah.
Africa. But yeah, the most of the animals that are really crucial to economics and agricultural production are not indigenous to Africa.
And also these things, I keep saying it, right? That everything that is in my paper, and that's the funny thing of this paper, I think, is in fact no longer true.
Yeah.
Because things are, let's say, changing now so rapidly that even this part of the story, if you would look at South Africa, one of the biggest, fastest growing industries there is actually the domestication of wild animals. Maybe domestication is not the right word in a biological sense, but at least the captivation of these animals and reproducing them and then selling them again for commercial purposes, whether these are giraffes or wildebeest or rhinos or whatever. It has become a very big industry there with its own institutions and its own very refined marketing systems.
Yes, but the reading, I'm always interested in data on Africa because originally it was understudied and now it's the new frontier in economic research. There's so much we still don't know.
About the past, you mean?
Yes, in Africa.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And there's even fewer Africans who are, let's say, sufficiently aware of their own past, I think.
Yes, but
And
there are some Africans, Paul, who are doing excellent work on Africa, in particularly the Benin Empire. I have been doing some research on the guild system in Benin, and there are people inside and outside of Africa who are applying theories of the state to explain the development of the Asante and the Dahomey empires. So work is being done.
I know, and it's also important that there is more recognition for that, because the biggest thing that can happen is that, let's say, lower levels of development in Africa are being interpreted as, let's say, lower intelligence by Africans. And that sounds very provocative, but if you give guest lectures and so on at African universities, that seems to be happening way too often. That people kind of make themselves smaller than they have to be. And it shouldn't be, because the opportunities are nowhere bigger than in Africa at the moment. So we need people with self-confidence there.
So and people lack self-confidence. Who are these people? Who are these people?
The people who lack self-confidence. These are
People
students
in
that are...
or students, university students in Africa, Europe. I want a geographical location. I assume that you're referring to students in Africa.
Yes, yes.
Or students in Africa lack self-confidence.
Sometimes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
some of them.
I've never been to Africa before, but as someone who is interested in the political and diplomatic history of pre-colonial Africa, I would say that this new generation of African academics is quite bold. Lack of self-confidence, no, I wouldn't apply that terminology.
No, not with these people. No, of course not. No,
Yeah.
but these are, of course, the people that made their way to the top, right?
Yes,
They
they're academics. So.
And but whenever I'm in Africa, I also like to do guest lectures, for example, with students. So I was in South Africa, in Ethiopia, in northern Benin, to name a few places. And this is something that I do see happening. There are people being quite pessimistic, right? And they ask me, coming from abroad, and I'm explaining all these opportunities to them, and then they say, oh, but I don't think that will work here, or we don't have enough capital, or lots of reasons for why not. And increasingly, luckily also, we see people who are actually seeing opportunities and who become role models to others. And this is becoming, let's say, a rapidly increasing pattern.
Yeah, but before we're wrapping up now, but before we go, I would never discount the role of intelligence in stimulating development. Presently, the evidence is growing, but I am not in a space yet where I can confidently explain why some people in sub-Saharan Africa on average have lower levels of intelligence. I cannot comment on that issue yet, but I can comment on studies showing that sub-Saharan Africa is lower in intelligence, and there are some studies that have found genetic variants associated with intelligence in certain parts of Europe. But as I said, at presently, we cannot definitively state why intelligence is lower in sub-Saharan Africa. But intelligence is seminal, it plays a seminal role in economic growth. It's linked to productivity, export production, and innovation. So we can never discount the role of intelligence.
I'm not an expert on that, of
Yes,
course, but
yeah.
I would
But
say what basically from what I read, from the few things I read about it, I what I remember is that, say, the genetic variety in Africa among humans is much higher than the genetic variety outside Africa, because ultimately it was just a small group that left, right, from Africa that populated the rest of the world. So I yeah, I refuse to think that that could be an explanation.
it's not, I'm not
Um,
willing to discount it. I'm not the
but yeah,
intelligent
no, I
arguments in
know.
relation to intelligence, I'm not willing to discount them
What
yet
what I would
because
find a plausible explanation is food security, is child development, for example. That as a child you will not get enough vitamins, nutrients, things for your personal development. That has a big impact on also the development of your brain, and that is something that we can do something about as human beings for other human beings.
why are Westerners so tall? I'm sure that you could be familiar with this research on the physiological origins of the wealth of nations. There is in fact a relationship between cognition and productivity, and cognition is linked to nutrition. So you're actually right. Nutrition is important.
Yeah, there's big initiatives also going on, I think, on improving nutrition in several ways. And of course, with the growing, like I said, I'm working for an agricultural university. So basically, the growing population in Africa and an agricultural productivity that cannot keep pace is something that bothers us a lot and that keeps us very busy. We
Yes.
search for solutions for that. Yeah.
And then, Paul, before we go again, we must also grapple with the deep roots of development in Africa. So for example, the clan system. The clan system can play a role in the scaling up of groups, but it can also hinder innovation. And this is a cultural barrier to development. I think that many barriers to development are cultural in nature.
Um, yes, it can. But the funny thing is that development in Africa seems to go the other way around as how it went in Europe. For example, in Europe, there was, of course, the development of agriculture. So there were food surpluses. And then these food surpluses were used to, let's say, set a certain class free from labor, and they could equip armies then, and these armies could fight over more land and so on. In Africa, it seems to go the other way around, right? So rather than that, let's say the development of agriculture caused the population increase, and then the population increase led to the development of cities and specialization of labor. In Africa, it seems that the population growth now stimulates the development of the cities and the specialization of labor there. And this requires then food production to keep pace with that. And that's some of the things that I've been reading and hearing about, and that I think, yeah, okay, that is a fundamentally different way of development than the pattern we had in Europe. And that also makes the business development in these cities and the linkages that these businesses make with the rural areas so important. And that's what I hope this paper can contribute to.
Yeah, your paper has contributed quite a bit. Don't worry. That's why I read from it directly, because I want to encourage listeners to go and read it. So when you're listening to the show, you should know what you are missing. But Paul, I'm enjoying the conversation, but unfortunately I have to go. But it has been a pleasure to have you as a guest with your innovative paper, Paul. You should share it on Twitter and with your colleagues. It's truly innovative. Bye.
Thank you very much. I've met very few people who have read my paper so carefully as you did, so I'm very impressed, and I'm looking forward to read yours.
When I do a journal, we'll have a lot of articles, not academic articles, but I have a lot of articles published by the Mises Institute and other places. So I'll just send you the emails. All right, then, bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.